Alright. Hello fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift into a quieter kind of question. Before Sumer, how old is human civilization really? Tonight, we follow the stones and the soil, not the myths, as we trace the long, slow awakening that began thousands of years before the first city lights rose over Mesopotamia. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science, slow storytelling, and deep time for the thinkers who can't quite fall asleep. We're not here to convince you of anything, only to walk with you through the evidence and see what the Earth remembers. Now imagine standing on a world divided not by borders but by cold. A world where the horizon is not a line but a wall of ice, and where every living thing, including us, wakes each morning with the same quiet calculation. Survive the next hour, then the next night, then the next season. In a place like this, long before the first cities or the first carved stones, the idea of civilization is not even a dream. It is a distant consequence of warmth, abundance, and time. And here, around 20,000 years before the present moment, none of those exist. What you have instead is wind, hunger, frozen rivers that shift like living creatures, and people, small in number, moving through landscapes vast enough to swallow any trace they leave behind. What if I told you that everything we later called civilization begins in a world that seems designed to prevent it? This is the heart of the Last Glacial Maximum, a period of sustained cold so profound that large parts of the northern hemisphere are covered by ice sheets thousands of meters thick. The climate models, the isotopic cores, the frozen stories held in pollen grains and lake mud all paint the same picture. Temperatures lower than today by enough degrees to bend ecosystems into new shapes, rainfall patterns fractured, coastlines dragged far outward as oceans retreat and turn into frozen walls. If you were human then, you would not have the luxury of imagining cities or temples or settled lives. Your days were built out of movement. Your homes were whatever the landscape allowed. And your notion of complexity was shaped not by ambition but by necessity. Archaeology gives us fragments of this life. They are small, quiet things, microliths no larger than your fingernail, scraps of animal bone etched by butchering marks, blackened circles where hearths once burned low fires of twisted shrubs and bone fat. These traces, when we place them carefully into the timeline of 20,000 years before now, reveal something subtle but profound. Humans were capable of intelligence, storytelling, symbolic thought, and long-distance memory, but the environment constrained how that intelligence could manifest. Complexity was not absent. It was simply survival-shaped. It lived in the fine margin between hunger and enough. Across the cold steppe, faunal remains tell us who shared this landscape with us. Reindeer, wild horse, woolly mammoth, saiga antelope. Their bones show patterns of hunting strategies adapted to scarcity. Cut marks appear in consistent places, suggesting practiced butchery techniques, careful resource extraction, and the communal sharing of tasks. The hearths themselves reveal how these groups lived, small, short-lived, and often ephemeral. The ash layers rarely stack more than a season or two. Charcoal residues show the burning of roots, bone, and tiny shrubs that grew only in the brief warmer weeks. These were not societies that could build with permanence. They built with fire and movement. Mobility defines this age, not by choice, but by ecological pressure. When the world is cold, food is not in one place for long. Herds move, rivers freeze or shift, plants grow only in pulses, so human groups follow the rhythms of animals, tracking migrations over hundreds of kilometers. Camps appear only where water is accessible and shelter is possible. Archaeological distribution patterns mapped through blade fragments and microlithic tool types show territories wider than many modern countries, used with an understanding of landscape that our settled lives rarely require. For these people, geography was not a map, it was memory. And memory was the greatest tool they possessed. This is also a world where population density is impossibly low. Genetic studies and archaeological modelling suggest that all of Eurasia may have held fewer humans than a single small modern town. With so few people spread across such large distances, the exchange of ideas, objects or innovations is slow and fragile. Knowledge survives because someone remembers it. It is not written, not stored, not archived. It is carried in muscle memory, in hands that know how to strike flint at exactly the right angle, in eyes trained to read tracks across snow, in shared stories told beneath hides stiff with frost. Complexity is here, but it is not cumulative. It resets each generation unless carefully passed through the fragile chain of teaching. If you were alive then, you would find beauty in strange places. The frost on mammoth hair, the crack of ice under full moon, the sound of reindeer hooves travelling through snow before you ever saw the herd. But you would not find stability. You would not find surplus. You would not find the conditions that allow civilization to root itself. Without surplus food, there can be no large populations. Without large populations, there can be no specialization. Without specialization, there can be no long-term architecture, no permanent settlement, no stored knowledge beyond what the mind can hold. Archaeologists sometimes pause over this period because it forces humility. These people were as intelligent as we are. Their brains were our brains. If you transported a child from 20,000 years ago into a modern classroom, they would learn mathematics, languages, and music with the same ease as any child today. But intelligence alone does not build civilizations. Ecology does, climate does, stability does, and during the last glacial maximum, none of those ingredients existed in any sustained form. Even so, hints of deep human behaviour surface. A decorated bone here, a rare pierced tooth used as an ornament, a cluster of shells carried hundreds of kilometres from the coast, meaning the person who owned them valued something enough to bear its weight across the ice. These are not markers of civilization. They are markers of humanity, a small insistence on beauty even when life is difficult. But they do not yet accumulate into cultural structures. They appear and then vanish, and then appear again generations later, each time newly invented because the previous memory faded into the cold. Paleoclimate data helps us understand why this world feels so resistant to complexity. When temperatures are low and seasonal swings are sharp, even small environmental changes have catastrophic effects. A dry year can shrink grazing lands. A storm season can collapse travel routes. Large groups cannot form because the land cannot feed them. And without large groups, the labour force required for any long-term project simply does not exist. Civilization is not prevented by lack of intelligence, but by lack of calories. Archaeologists often note the fragility of settlement traces from this era. Hearths disappear quickly, wood rots, hides leave no imprint. Even stone tools, unless they break, are carried onward, leaving only occasional flakes behind. The result is a quiet archaeological record that can appear deceptively simple. But simplicity does not mean primitiveness. It means a life shaped by efficiency. Everything must be portable. Everything must matter. There is no room for error. In a sense, these societies reach a different kind of complexity. The complexity of survival systems honed over millennia, tuned perfectly to the demands of the ice. If you imagine these people as less capable than later farmers or city builders, the evidence gently corrects you. The decision-making seen in hunting strategies, in seasonally adjusted movements, in the selection of stone types for tools speaks to careful observation, and accumulated ecological intelligence. But ecological intelligence is not the same as cultural infrastructure. To build a civilization, humans need something this era cannot offer: time that is not devoted to survival. And yet, without knowing it, these groups carry the seeds of what will come. Their mapping of landscapes becomes the future pathways of migrations that will fill the warming world. Their tool strategies become the foundation for later innovations. Their social structures, small and flexible, become the templates for emerging kinship systems when the environment finally softens. Civilization does not begin here, but it waits here, patiently. When warmth eventually returns at the close of this long frozen age, the world will shift. Plants will spread, herds will settle, rivers will run with more predictable rhythms, and in that new stability, humans will begin to experiment with staying. The story of civilization does not start with stone pillars or cities rising in the desert. It begins here, on the edge of the ice, in the quiet persistence of people who endure long enough for possibility to exist. Without them, nothing that follows would be possible. As we leave this frozen landscape behind, the question lingers not as a riddle, but as a reflection. How fragile were the beginnings of the species that would one day reshape the world, and how much of their resilience still lives inside us, waiting for the moments when life becomes cold again? If you enjoy this kind of calm archaeology, feel free to gently like or subscribe, not for numbers, but because it helps other late-night minds find a little quiet education too. And if you're listening in bed, working, driving, or drifting somewhere in between, tell me in the comments how these stories keep you company. And if you fall asleep halfway through, the timestamps will be waiting when you return. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. After thousands upon thousands of years of walking, a group of humans arrives somewhere that feels different. The wind still moves across the water, the seasons still lean toward cold, but something in the land invites them to pause. Maybe it's a shoreline where fish gather predictably each spring. Maybe it is a cluster of wild plants that return year after year. Maybe it is simply a place where the world feels kind. Whatever the reason, for the first time in a very long story, a mobile species begins to wonder whether moving is still the only way to live. Between 18,000 and 15,000 years before the present, small pockets of the world shift just enough to make this question possible. Not everywhere, not even in most places, but along certain lakes, in sheltered valleys, and beside rivers that carry warmth or nutrients from far away, resource density increases. The ice is still here, but it loosens its grip on the edges, and in those edges, humans begin the first experiments with staying. Archaeology gives us some of the clearest glimpses of these moments at a site called Ohalo II, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It exists because fate intervened. A settlement built in a cooler, harsher climate ended up preserved beneath rising water, sealed beneath sediments for millennia. When it re-emerged in the late 20th century, it revealed a world that felt startlingly intimate. Huts built from brushwood, hearths still encircled by stones, grinding slabs used to process wild grains long before anyone ever thought of domesticating them. A range of seeds, fruits, and fish bones telling us that people here were not merely passing through. They returned season after season to the same strip of lakeshore. It is not a village. It is not permanent. But it is something new, a recurring home. What if I told you that staying, even briefly, changes everything? Because once people return to a place, they begin to know it in a different way. They notice the specific patch where edible plants sprout earliest each year. They learn where gazelles cross the reed beds during migration. They understand when the water level drops just enough to expose fish-rich shallows. This knowledge accumulates not as survival skill, but as place memory. For the first time, the land becomes not just a passage, but a companion. At Ohalo too, the remains of structures suggest planning greater than a single night's camp. Brushwood walls woven tightly, perhaps repaired across multiple seasons. Hearths reused until layers of ash built up. People lived here long enough to leave not just tools, but habits. Some huts are carefully oriented, as if the settlement had a logic rather than scattering randomly across the shore. A few storage pits appear, small and simple but meaningful. They show the first step toward a future humans do not yet envision, holding food for later. But Ohalo is only one whisper in a broader pattern. Far to the northeast, on the edges of the Jordanian steppe, another site offers a different angle on the same phenomenon. Carene 4, occupied around 18,000 years before now, reveals massive accumulations of hearths and artifacts layered over centuries. Not a city, not even close, but something that pushes beyond the idea of a single group passing through. Thousands of stone tools, animal bones in quantities that suggest gatherings larger than typical mobile bands, and most intriguingly, a few structures built with enough care that archaeologists describe them as huts rather than mere shelters. These were places where people stayed long enough to leave footprints of community. The density of debris suggests seasonal aggregation, where multiple groups met, shared, exchanged, and likely strengthened social ties. Staying, even temporarily, has consequences. When groups meet in predictable places, they exchange more than resources. They exchange knowledge, tool-making tricks, hunting strategies, marriage partners, stories, ideas about the world and the way it moves. These social networks that stretch across the late Pleistocene begin to tighten. You can see it in the obsidian flakes at Carene 4, sourced from distant volcanic fields. You can see it in the shell beads carried far inland from the Mediterranean coast. Movement is still central to life, but movement begins to have meaningful destinations. Across the Zagros Mountains and the valleys of southwestern Asia, the Zazi culture offers yet another perspective. Here, people navigated steep terrain rich in wild goat, gazelle, and seasonal plants. Their camps show patterns consistent with return visits, repeated fireplace locations, specific tool types left behind in predictable clusters, and signs of longer stays than typical hunter-gatherer expeditions. These sites hint at a relationship with place that is not quite sedentary, but no longer purely nomadic. A middle state. An experiment. What ties these distant locations together is not a shared culture, but a shared evolutionary moment. The world is warming slightly after the coldest depths of the Last Glacial Maximum. Plants grow in greater abundance, animals stabilize their ranges, rivers swell with meltwater. Humans respond to this increased predictability in the only way a flexible species can. They explore new patterns of living. They pause. They return. They begin to invest in places, even if only for a few weeks each year. The archaeological record shows this shift not through monumental evidence, but through subtleties. Grinding stones appear more frequently, suggesting an intensification of plant processing. Hearths cluster closer together, showing repeated occupation. Charcoal layers deepen in some sites, implying continued use of the same fire pits. Bone assemblages become more diverse, indicating broader diets that reduce risk and allow people to stay longer. These quiet indicators collectively show that human groups are building a rhythm with the land. This is the moment where time begins to bend differently. For a constantly moving species, time is measured in distances. When you stay in one place, even seasonally, time becomes something you can build with. You can repair a hut. You can anticipate a harvest. You can trust that a shoreline will give life again next year. This kind of time opens the door to stability, and stability opens the door to everything that follows. Still, it is important to be humble here. These are not the beginnings of villages. They are not steps toward an inevitable future. They are experiments shaped by ecology. If resources failed, people would leave. If climate snapped back into cold, the land would empty again. The resilience of these early site clusters lies in their flexibility, not their permanence. And yet, without naming it or planning it, these early groups seeded the foundations of what will, thousands of years later, become settlement. They learned how to live in relationship with a landscape rather than only passing through it. They learned that returning to a place can be safer than wandering into the unknown. They learned, perhaps without noticing, that community deepens when people share not just journeys but addresses, however temporary. There is a quiet power in these moments. Archaeology often prefers the dramatic, but here in the fire pits and brushwood circles of 18 to 15,000 years ago, we see something more fundamental. We see the human species learning to stay long enough for memory to accumulate in one location, long enough for traditions to root in a place, long enough for knowledge to linger on the ground after a group walks away. If civilization is, in its simplest form, the settling of knowledge into physical space, then this is where the earliest glimmers of that process begin. Not through architecture or surplus or hierarchy, but through a species discovering that some landscapes are worth returning to. And once you return, even for a season, you begin to imagine what it might be like to stay longer next time, or the time after that. As we move forward, deeper into the warming world that follows, that imagination will slowly transform into construction, storage, cooperation, and finally into the first settled communities humanity ever built. But at this point in the story, nothing is guaranteed. These early experiments are fragile, held together by climate, by chance, and by the quiet curiosity that has always defined us. The question that lingers is simple and enormous. How does a species accustomed to movement discover the meaning of home? After thousands of years of cold so deep it carved silence into the continents, the air begins to soften. Not enough for comfort, not enough for warmth as we know it, but enough for possibility, enough for plants that once clung to sheltered valleys to creep outward, enough for animals to linger longer in certain basins, enough for humans to notice that the world, for the first time in a very long time, is breathing differently. Around 14,000 to 13,000 years before our present moment, during what paleoclimatologists call the Berling-Allerud warming, something extraordinary unfolds. It is not a civilization, it is not even a stable settlement, it is a spark, and that spark changes everything. What if I told you that when the earth warms, humans do not become comfortable, they become curious? Comfort is a concept invented later. What warming really offers is variability. It breaks the monotony of cold, and in that sudden shift, new shapes of life appear. Imagine ecosystems rearranging themselves like a puzzle shaken loose. Birch and hazel spreading northward, grasses returning to valleys where ice once sat heavy, rivers flowing more predictably, lakes filling with meltwater. These ecological changes create niches, and niches create opportunities. Humans, with our restless minds and our uniquely wired brains, respond not with contentment, but with experimentation. The paleoclimate record is clear. In ice cores from Greenland, you see the abrupt jump, layers of trapped oxygen isotopes telling us the air warmed at a speed that defies ordinary climate cycles. In lake sediments across Eurasia, pollen sequences shift rapidly from sparse tundra species to richer woodland assemblages. In animal bones layered in archaeological sites, we see shifts in migration patterns, species ranges, and abundance. Everything is in motion, and motion is the fuel that human creativity burns. In this warmer world, the landscape becomes more predictable in some seasons and more diverse in others. Where predictability appears, humans settle for longer stretches. Where diversity appears, diets broaden. And where both combine, something remarkable begins, the first hints of cognitive surplus. Scientists sometimes talk about brain energy trade-offs, the idea that complex thought requires calories, stability, and time not devoted solely to survival. During the Last Glacial Maximum, those resources barely existed. But now, in the Belling-Alarud warmth, there is slightly more food, slightly more variety, slightly more security. That slight difference accumulates in the only place evolution allows it to accumulate quickly, the human mind. You can see this shift reflected in stone tool industries. Microliths become more standardized. Composite tools appear with greater regional variation, suggesting innovation spreading through social networks. Bladelets show signs of more efficient production. This is not random change. It is the behavior of groups experimenting with their environment because the environment finally gives them room to do so. Warm valleys also draw people together. As resources cluster, so do humans. Archaeological sites from this period, whether in the Levant, Anatolia or parts of Europe, begin to show signs of increased population density. More hearths in one location, more sleeping areas, more refuse scattered around a central point. These are not permanent settlements, but they are longer stays with larger groups. And when groups grow, ideas flow. The anthropologist's simple formula holds true across millennia. More people means more innovation. Long-distance social networks expand during this time, something we know not from stories but from stones. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for toolmaking, appears hundreds of kilometers from its source. Chemical fingerprinting lets scientists match each obsidian piece to a specific volcanic origin. The patterns are astonishing. Stones from central Anatolia appear deep in the Levant. Stones from eastern Turkey appear in sites far to the west. This means groups were travelling or trading across distances that were unthinkable during colder, harsher epochs. Isotope studies deepened our understanding even further. Strontium isotopes and human teeth preserved from this era suggest individuals moved across different geological zones during their lives. They were mobile, yes, but not randomly mobile. Their paths followed known routes, connecting locations that likely served as seasonal meeting points. Here, in these meeting places, ideas were exchanged along with obsidian blades and food. Social bonds widened. Information travelled faster than any single group could walk. Curiosity became a shared currency. The warming also altered the way humans perceived risk. In the colder world, risk meant starvation or exposure. In the warmer Belling-Alarud world, risk became something subtler, choosing where to invest time. Do you return to the same valley next year? Do you experiment with new ways of hunting abundant smaller game? Do you try storing more plant foods, since they now appear more predictably? These decisions require foresight, and foresight is the soil where cultural complexity grows. Animal bones from this period show a shift in hunting strategy. Instead of relying predominantly on massive Ice Age herbivores, many groups turned to smaller, more abundant prey that required cooperative hunting and planning. This diversification suggests cognitive flexibility. It also suggests that humans were adjusting to landscapes that offered choices rather than mandates. You could hunt this or that, gather here or there, settle in one place for longer or move to another valley. Choices open mental space. and mental space opens curiosity. It might seem counterintuitive that warming leads not to comfort but to cultural explosions, but the archaeological record leaves little doubt. In many regions, art becomes more diverse. Engravings, ornaments, and personal adornments proliferate. Long-distance trade intensifies. Seasonal aggregation sites become more structured. Technological innovations accelerate. All of this unfolds not because humans finally have enough, but because the world begins offering more than one way to live. When the environment stops dictating every move, people begin imagining new moves. There's a humility in studying this era. We know the broad strokes. We can trace pollen sequences and analyze obsidian. We can model temperature curves. But we cannot step inside the minds of the people who lived this transition. We can only infer that, based on the material traces they left, something in them was awakening. Something that responded to warming not with complacency but with exploration. Imagine a group returning to a valley where the spring now arrives earlier. Rivers run clearer. Animals gather in new patterns. Edible plants sprout in places where, for generations, there had been only frost. The group pauses. They observe. They try something new. Perhaps they store more food. Perhaps they build a more substantial shelter. Perhaps they stay a little longer. Perhaps they meet another group doing the same. These tiny changes accumulate in the slow generational rhythm that defines human evolution. They are small in scale, but massive in consequence. This is also a time when identities begin to shift. Larger groups require new social norms. Intergroup exchanges require trust, symbolism, and shared understanding. Archaeologists often see increases in ornament styles during this period, which may reflect expanding identity signals. A bead is not a civilization, but a bead that travels hundreds of kilometers is a message. It is the quiet beginning of regional cultures, not defined by walls or cities, but by relationships. The warming also reshapes childhood. In a slightly more predictable world, children may survive at slightly higher rates. Slightly higher survival shifts population balance. More children mean more learners. More learners mean more transmission of knowledge. In evolutionary terms, this is transformative. Cultures with young minds capable of absorbing skills flourish rapidly when ecological conditions favour stability. By the end of the Berling-Allerud period, the human world looks nothing like the glacial world that preceded it. Still mobile, still shaped by uncertainty, but carrying the first threads of a tapestry that will later become settlements, storage, architecture, and beyond. The warming did not create civilization. It created the conditions that made curiosity sustainable. It allowed humans to explore not only landscapes, but ideas. And as we move forward into the next chapter, the warmth that brought such creative possibility will be interrupted again. The climate will snap back into cold. But the experiments humans began in the Berling-Allerud will not vanish. They will wait in the memory of landscapes and the hands of people who have learned that the world can change and that changing worlds ask for new ways of living. Imagine this. A group of humans walks into a valley they have known for generations, but this time something feels different. The air is warmer than the year before. The grasses grow in dense, soft waves. Animals linger longer. And as the group scans the familiar ground, someone pauses, just long enough for a new question to appear in the mind. What if this place could be more than a stop along a journey? What if it could hold a shape they create? This quiet moment, around 13,000 to 11,000 years before our time, marks the earliest stirrings of architecture. Not grand monuments, not towering structures, but the first human attempts to shape space, to draw boundaries, and to imagine that the land could hold intention. What if I told you that architecture did not begin with civilization? That it began long before agriculture, long before cities, long before anyone thought of permanence? The first walls were not built because people settled. They were built because people began to think differently about place. Archaeology shows this shift most clearly in the Natufian culture of the Levant, a society that stands at the threshold between mobility and stability. Their world, warmed by the Bering-Alerud climate shifts, offered resources in abundance. Valleys filled with wild cereals, hillsides with gazelle and deer, rivers and springs that no longer froze. And in this gentle ecological cradle, humans experimented with shaping their surroundings. At sites like Ein Malahar and Hayonim, you can still see the earliest traces of deliberate construction. Not huts made of brushwood scattered haphazardly across the landscape, but circular dwellings carved into the earth. Imagine standing at the entrance of one of these dwellings, looking at a shallow pit dug carefully into the ground. The walls, supported by stones arranged in low rings, rise just enough to hold a roof made of branches and reeds. The floor is compacted earth, smooth from repeated use. Hearths lie at the centre, their ash layers built up from years of glowing fires. These structures are not improvisations, they are designs. Their circular shape is not a coincidence. Circles distribute heat evenly. Circles are structurally stable. Circles invite gathering, and in archaeological deposits from this period, we find evidence that these dwellings persisted for decades. They were repaired, extended, modified. The same foundation stones remained while generations of roofs were renewed. This is the earliest architectural memory humans ever left behind. Architecture here begins with containment. People dig into the ground to create a space protected from wind, rain, and animals. They line the edges with stones to prevent collapse. They install hearths at the centre, not at the periphery, suggesting shared activity. And outside these dwellings, archaeologists find clusters of stone tools and food, refuse that indicate outdoor workspaces. The very arrangement of space tells a story. Sleeping inside, working outside, gathering around fire. This separation of tasks is architecture, even before walls rise fully above the earth. Another remarkable discovery comes from the orientation of dwellings. Some early structures face consistent directions, likely chosen based on wind patterns, sunlight, or access to nearby resources. This level of environmental awareness shows that humans were thinking not just about surviving a night, but about inhabiting a place. The landscape becomes something to consider, respond to, and shape. Architecture is not building, it is thinking. As we move deeper into Natufian territory, another pattern emerges. Communal structures appear. These are not dwellings. They are larger, often with thicker walls, sometimes dug deeper into the earth. Their purpose remains debated, but most researchers agree they served as shared spaces for rituals, gatherings, or collective decisions. The presence of these communal buildings signals an important shift. Humans are beginning to create spaces for ideas, not just bodies. Within these early structures, archaeologists find burials, sometimes beneath house floors, sometimes in small clusters near the foundations. The placement of graves inside domestic architecture suggests that the structure itself held meaning beyond shelter. It became a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where memory anchored itself physically. These burials are not decorative, they are decisions. They show people shaping space to honour relationships, identities, and histories. Architecture here becomes a form of storytelling told with stone, earth, and distance. One of the most intriguing features of these early architectural experiments is continuity. People returned to the same locations repeatedly. They rebuilt in the same spots. They followed the outlines of previous structures. This reuse suggests that the idea of place had begun to solidify in human minds. Even if groups moved seasonally, they carried a mental map of the world in which certain points became meaningful. This cognitive shift is monumental, even if the structures themselves are small. We also see the beginnings of what anthropologists call spatial cognition. This refers to how humans mentally organize space, how they understand boundaries, directions, and relationships between places. As architecture emerges, spatial cognition evolves. People begin to distinguish between inside and outside, between public and private, between sacred and ordinary. They relate these distinctions to specific physical forms. A low stone wall is not merely a barrier, it is a symbolic line between the world and the home. The evidence for this shift shows up even in small artifacts. The distribution of tools within dwellings is not random. Certain types cluster near hearths, others near entrances, others in specific corners. This consistent pattern across multiple sites suggests that people were structuring their lives around spatial rules. These rules are the children of architecture. By around 12,000 years before the present, in places like Wadi Hame and Einan, the earliest ground stone tools become more common. These heavy items are awkward to transport long distances, meaning that people left them in their dwellings with the expectation of returning. These objects act as anchors. They tie people to places. They signal a growing sense that a location can hold value through time, even if absence interrupts occupancy. Architecture also changes the way groups relate to each other. Living in a structured spaces means living closer together, which increases social coordination. Boundaries create shared expectations. They define who belongs where. The first architecture is therefore also the first social negotiation of space. Across these early sites, refuse patterns accumulate in recognizable zones. Waste is thrown outside dwellings in consistent directions. Working areas develop signature debris fields. Some sites show evidence of small pathways formed simply by repeated footfall. These paths, subtle as they are the earliest human-made lines on a landscape. They speak to the predictability of movement, to the formation of routines, to the choreography of daily life. Another revealing layer appears in the fireplaces. In earlier periods, hearths were often placed wherever space allowed. But in this era, they begin to appear in standardized locations within dwellings. A central hearth suggests a shared locus, where family or group members gathered evenly. A side hearth, by contrast, may indicate specialized tasks or different communal patterns. These choices tell us that early humans were beginning to design not just shelters, but experiences. Even in death, architecture shapes behavior. Some Natufian graves show bodies adorned with beads or placed in specific orientations. Others appear beneath house floors, suggesting a belief in connection between home and ancestry. The integration of burial practices into constructed space marks a major cognitive shift. The idea that the home extends beyond the living. Walls are not just functional, they are symbolic containers of continuity. Architecture at this stage is entirely pre-agricultural. People are not building permanent towns, they are building long-term relationships with places. They are testing the limits of what a constructed environment offers, and in doing so, they begin forming identities tied to specific landscapes. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as the earliest form of placemaking. It is the process by which humans take a natural feature and turn it into a location with meaning. A dwelling dug into the earth, a hearth built with intention, a burial beneath a floor. These are acts of placemaking. They transform geography into memory. By the end of this period, around 11,000 years before today, humans across the Levant are building structures with increasingly sophisticated features. Some walls are double-lined, Some floors are plastered. Some dwellings show rebuilding phases stacked like chapters in an unspoken story. Each layer reflects adaptation, preference, and learning. Architecture is becoming a skill, not just an act. What makes this moment so profound is that it unfolds before the invention of agriculture. This reverses the narrative many of us grew up with. Settlements do not begin with farming. Farming begins with settlements. The willingness to stay, however briefly, precedes the knowledge of how to cultivate plants. Architecture is the bridge that connects movement with stability. It is the physical manifestation of a mind beginning to imagine that the world can be shaped, not only endured. And so we end this part of the journey with a quiet realization. The first architecture was not built to protect people from the world. It was built to create a world within the world. A small circle of stone, a hearth at its centre, and a family gathered inside. That is where the long story of human environments begins. The question that lingers gently is whether humans shaped these spaces, or whether these spaces shaped the humans who dreamed of what might one day rise from stone and earth. You walk along a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, the sun still low enough to turn every shadow into a soft blue. The ground beneath your feet is quiet, but something about it feels used, shaped, known. And then you see it. A ring of massive stones emerging from the earth, each carved into a precise T-shape, each taller than a person, each arranged with a deliberate geometry. No farms surround it, no villages, no pottery, no metal tools. The people who built this place, around 9,600 years before our time, were hunter-gatherers, and yet they created what may be the world's first monumental architecture. Nothing about this makes sense at first glance, but the closer we look, the clearer the story becomes, grounded not in myth or mystery, but in evidence, real stone, real marks, real hands. What if I told you that the people who built the first monuments were not a lost civilization with forgotten technology, but ordinary humans responding to an extraordinary moment in history? The world was warming, plants and animals were shifting, social networks were expanding, and in this changing landscape, humans began gathering in larger numbers than ever before. Göbekli Tepe did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from a pattern of increasing settlement stability, ritual cohesion, and long-term planning that had been building for millennia, even among mobile groups. The site itself sits on a limestone plateau, an ideal location for quarrying. Archaeologists have identified the original stone extraction pits, where builders shaped pillars straight from the bedrock. You can still see the channel cuts where stone hammers chipped along the outlines of each T-shaped monolith. These cuts are rough, consistent and entirely achievable with flint and limestone tools. There are unfinished pillars still attached to the bedrock, some tilted, some abandoned mid-process. These are not the traces of forgotten technology. They are the traces of learning curves, of attempts, of mistakes. They show a human process. Try, adjust, refine. Every pillar bears the story of its making. On the surfaces, microscopic wear patterns reveal the use of flint chisels and hammerstones. On the bases, cut marks indicate careful shaping, so the pillars would fit into carved sockets in the bedrock floors of the enclosures. This means the builders were not only skilled at shaping stone, but also understood the architectural logic required to stabilize massive vertical elements. They carved foundation sockets before lifting the pillars, a kind of prehistoric engineering sequence that required planning far beyond the daily needs of a mobile band. Transporting the pillars, some weighing several tons, didn't require wheels or draft animals. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe slopes gently, and experimental archaeology suggests that small groups of people could move such stones using wooden sledges, ropes twisted from plant fibres, and earthen ramps. Friction-reducing materials such as wet clay or animal fat might have been used, though this remains speculative. What is not speculative is that no advanced machinery was needed. The physics of moving large stones is straightforward when enough people work together with coordinated effort. The question then becomes, why would hunter-gatherers gather in such large groups? The answer lies not in machines, but in feasting. Thousands upon thousands of animal bones have been found around the site, many belonging to gazelles, wild cattle, and wild boar. The bones show cut marks consistent with large-scale butchery. Burn patterns in fire pits reveal high-temperature cooking. Grinding stones, some weighing dozens of kilograms, suggest processing plant foods in quantities much higher than typical daily use. What emerges is a picture of periodic large gatherings, where hundreds of people may have come together for ritual events marked by shared meals. Feasts are powerful social tools. They build alliances, maintain networks, exchange information, and reinforce shared beliefs. They provide the labour force needed for construction. Another striking feature of Göbekli Tepe is its layered construction. Each circular enclosure was built, used for a period, deliberately filled with debris and then buried. A new enclosure was built on top. This pattern repeats across multiple building phases. The deliberate backfilling is one of the most revealing clues to the site's purpose. These were not abandoned structures, they were respectfully retired. The filling deposits contained stone tools, animal bones, and debris from feasting. This suggests a ritual closure ceremony, a communal act of ending one chapter before beginning another. It is the earliest evidence we have of architectural renewal cycles, a concept that appears much later in settled societies but begins here among mobile groups. Inside the enclosures, the pillars stand in pairs, with two central pillars usually larger and more elaborately carved. Their surfaces show relief carvings of foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and abstract symbols. These are not random decorations. They appear in consistent orientations and combinations across multiple enclosures. This suggests a shared symbolic system, perhaps relating to group identity, social roles, or cosmological beliefs. We do not know exactly what the symbols mean, and as humble researchers, we must accept that some meanings are lost. But we do know that carving these figures required time, focus, and an understanding of stone that only comes from skilled hands. Importantly, these carvings show no evidence of metal tools. The cuts are consistent with flint flake chisels and stone hammers. Slow, patient work. The way a sculptor's hand moves because they have chosen to, not because they have machinery. This alone speaks volumes. The first monuments were not built because new technology appeared. They were built because new social structures emerged. Cooperation became more coordinated. Leadership may have become more ceremonial. Ritual gatherings became more elaborate. Around the site, archaeologists have found remains of small, temporary shelters. These were not permanent homes. Göbekli Tepe was not a village. People came here from other parts of the region, stayed for days or weeks, and then left. This reinforces the idea that the site served a special purpose, not an everyday one. It was a meeting place, a ritual ground, a place where groups gathered to renew ties, resolve tensions, and reaffirm shared identities. We also find evidence of long-distance connections. Stone tools made from obsidian sourced from eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia show that people travelled or traded across wide areas. Shell beads from the Mediterranean coast appear far inland. Pigments used in carving seem to come from multiple geological sources. These materials are fingerprints of a network, a web of relationships spanning hundreds of kilometres. Göbekli Tepe may have been one of the nodal points where these networks converged. To understand how people organised labour for construction, we turn to ethnographic parallels. In many hunter-gatherer societies, large communal events are powered not by coercion, but by ritual obligation, shared identity, and reciprocal feasting. Building something monumental is an act of belonging. It strengthens social bonds. It marks participation in a narrative larger than one's own life. When viewed through this lens, the construction of Göbekli Tepe becomes not a technological mystery, but a social triumph. A group of people, not yet farmers, not yet settled, chose to build something together because the act itself created meaning. The site's builders also demonstrated impressive knowledge of stone. The pillars are aligned within circular or oval enclosures, some with clear spatial symmetry. Doorways, benches and low walls appear between pillars. These architectural features mirror a deep understanding of how people move within spaces. Even without permanent habitation, the builders designed the enclosures to shape experience. To enter an enclosure, one typically passed through a narrow opening between pillars, moving into an interior space where the central pillars dominated the view. This is architecture guiding attention. It suggests that the rituals performed inside had specific sensory intentions. One of the more subtle insights comes from studying the debris zones. The distribution of stone flakes, broken tools, and animal bones shows distinct activity areas. Some regions were used for carving pillars, others for butchering animals, others for social gatherings. This spatial organisation reveals that even though the site was not permanently occupied, people used it in structured ways. They understood the purpose of each enclosure and the tasks required to maintain it. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of Göbekli Tepe is the knowledge that its builders later buried it, long before erosion or abandonment could destroy it. This act shows a kind of reverence. People did not leave the site to fade on its own. They chose to end it, and in that choice lies evidence of symbolic depth we cannot fully decode. Why bury a sacred place? Was it a gesture of closure, a ritual transformation, a shift in belief? We cannot answer with certainty, but the deliberate nature of the act suggests meaning far beyond maintenance. As we stand on this ridge imagining the people who built the first monuments, we realize they were not mysterious. They were human. They used tools we understand. They carved stone with techniques we can replicate. They worked together for reasons we can recognize. Identity, ritual, belonging. And yet they created something entirely new in human history. A space not for shelter, but for meaning. A circle of stone that stands at the threshold of architecture and ceremony. The question that drifts quietly from this ancient hill is simple. What changed in us when we decided to build something that lasted longer than our own lives? Perhaps the story of civilization does not begin with farming or cities, but here with people who lifted stone from the earth and shaped it into memory. Imagine this. You're standing in a landscape with no cities, no farms, no metal. Around you are only limestone ridges, patches of scrub, and distant herds moving across the hills. The people beside you carry nothing more advanced than flint blades, wooden poles, and ropes twisted from plant fibres, and yet, before the day is over, this group will cut a multi-ton block of stone from the bedrock, lift it from its socket, drag it across uneven ground, and stand it upright in a carefully prepared pit. No wheels, no draft animals, no architecture schools, just physics, muscle, coordination, and intention. If I told you this was 10,000 years before today, long before agriculture had fully taken root, it might feel like contradiction. But this is exactly what happened. Engineering appeared long before civilization. What if the question is not how they did it, but why we ever believed they couldn't? The word primitive lingers in modern imagination, but archaeology steadily dismantles it. The people of 10,000 to 9,000 years before our time were cognitively identical to us. They understood leverage, friction, balance, and material properties because they lived in constant intimacy with nature. Their engineering was not an anomaly, it was an extension of their daily lives. To understand how stone was moved before cities existed, we begin with the quarries. Across early monumental sites of the early Holocene, you find the same basic pattern. Stones cut directly from bedrock using hammerstones made of harder stone, often basalt or flint. Repeated percussion leaves pockmarks and linear channels outlining the desired shape. Experiments today show that a group of skilled knappers can detach a multi-ton block in a matter of hours when the limestone is soft. The unfinished pillars still attached to the ground at these sites are not mysteries. They are the frozen pauses in a human process we can still replicate with the same techniques. Once a pillar is freed, the challenge becomes movement. And here, experimental archaeology provides clarity. When you drag a heavy object across flat ground, friction is the enemy. But humans learned early how to control it. One of the simplest solutions is the sledge, a flat surface that distributes weight and allows the load to slide. A wooden sledge, lubricated occasionally with water, clay, or even animal fat, can reduce friction dramatically. Studies have shown that with proper lubrication, dragging a multi-ton stone requires surprisingly little force per person, especially when many hands cooperate. But sledges alone are not enough. The real innovation is the rope. Early ropes were made by twisting plant fibers, animal sinew or bark. Experimental reconstructions show that such ropes can reach enormous tensile strength. When many ropes are attached to a sledge and many people pull in synchrony, momentum builds. The stone does not need to be lifted, it simply needs to glide. The physics is simple. Once sliding, an object in motion stays in motion unless friction stops it. What took the most effort was not the pull, but the coordination. Biomechanics research adds an unexpected insight. Human beings are extremely efficient at pulling loads when working in groups, especially in rhythmic unison. The human body, when leaning forward slightly with arms extended, can exert force in ways that maximize leg strength, which is far greater than arm strength. Hunters in this period were accustomed to hauling carcasses, dragging hides, and working in coordinated hunting lines. Moving stone, in biomechanical terms, is simply another cooperative hauling task. When the ground became uneven, people turned to another timeless tool, the lever. A pole inserted under a pillar's edge, with a rock acting as a fulcrum, could lift the stone just enough to slide a support beneath it. Repeating this process inch by inch allows a massive block to be raised gradually. Levers multiply human strength. A person who can lift 30 kilograms with their hands can lift several hundred kilograms with a meter-long lever. Multiply that by 20 people working simultaneously, and you can manipulate a stone that weighs many tons without any advanced tools. No magic, just physics. To keep stones from sinking into soft earth, people lay down layers of brush, wood, or smaller stones to create temporary roadbeds. These mats distribute weight and prevent sledges from digging into the ground. Such roadbeds have been reconstructed in experiments and can be built using nothing more than branches and time. Once the stone reaches its destination, the problem of raising it begins. But here, gravity is the friend, not the enemy. Most early standing stones were raised by tilting them slowly into prepared pits. Workers dig a deep slot and angle the stone so that one edge rests near the pit. Then ropes are attached high on the stone, and people pull from the far side while others use levers to push from below. As the stone tilts, its centre of gravity shifts until it drops gently into the pit. At that moment, a team fills in the pit with stones, earth, and packing material. This stabilises the pillar and transfers its weight evenly through the base. Experimental archaeologists have raised multi-ton stones this way, using only replicas of Stone Age tools. The process is slow, but it is not mysterious. It is the accumulation of force, timing, and cooperation. Engineering before cities also relied on something less tangible: social cohesion. Moving large stones is not simply a technical operation. It requires a motivated workforce, and motivation, in societies without rulers or bureaucracy, flows from ritual, alliance, reciprocity, and shared identity. Feasting, ceremonies, seasonal gatherings, and religious events acted as the social engines that powered early engineering projects. People gathered not for wages, but for meaning. Participating in building something monumental was itself a form of belonging. When archaeologists model the workforce needed to move a pillar of several tons, estimates range from 40 to 100 people depending on terrain. This is entirely feasible for hunter-gatherer societies during seasonal aggregations, when groups from wide areas came together to reinforce alliances, find mates, exchange goods, and celebrate rituals. During these gatherings, building projects became community events that strengthened social ties. Engineering in this sense was not separate from life. It was part of how communities defined themselves. Understanding stone movement also requires understanding landscape choice. Early builders often selected sites on plateaus or ridges where stone was abundant and terrain allowed easier movement. The layout of these landscapes shaped engineering. Slight downward slopes could be used to roll or drag stones with gravity assisting. Flat surfaces allowed staging areas. Natural depressions could serve as quarrying pits. When we see where ancient builders worked, the logic of their choices becomes evident. They were not fighting the landscape, they were using it. Pre-agricultural societies were also masterful students of stone behaviour. They knew which limestone blocks fractured cleanly and which ones crumbled. They understood weight distribution intuitively. When shaping pillars, they smoothed faces selectively to prevent stress fractures. They carved sockets in bedrock floors that matched the bases of pillars with precision, ensuring stability. The physics of stone behaviour was learned through repeated practice over generations. This knowledge was cultural, not written, but just as effective. Global parallels appear cautiously and scientifically. Across regions where no cities existed yet, humans were already moving stone in impressive ways. In parts of Europe during the late Mesolithic, large stones were used to mark burial areas or communal spaces. In regions of Asia, stone platforms and alignments appear well before settled agriculture. These parallels reinforce a simple truth: engineering does not require civilization. It requires cooperation, knowledge of materials, and a reason to work together. One of the most revealing insights comes from wear patterns on tools left at early monumental sites. Flint chisels show repeated percussion impacts consistent with stone carving. Hammerstones made of basalt or other tough materials show flattened surfaces from thousands of strikes. The density of tool debris suggests specialized tasks performed by individuals who are skilled in them. This implies that even in mobile societies, craftsmanship existed. People learned by doing, teaching others, and refining their skills. Specialization does not require cities. It requires patience. Archaeologists studying wear on human skeletons also find patterns related to strenuous hauling, lifting, and repetitive motion. Musculoskeletal markers suggest that early builders engaged in physically demanding tasks regularly. These skeletal indicators help us construct a picture of daily life. Strong backs, powerful legs, and hands used to grip ropes and levers. It reminds us that engineering without machines is not impossible. It is embodied. Another valuable approach is computer modelling. Researchers create simulations of hauling tasks using estimates of rope strength, friction coefficients, slope angles, and human force output. These models consistently show that early hunter-gatherer communities could move and erect stones much larger than we might assume. When rhythm, teamwork, and terrain are optimized, the effort becomes manageable. The bottleneck is not strength but coordination, and coordination is something these societies excelled at. Still, humility is required. We do not know every detail. Some methods are inferred rather than proven. The exact rituals, songs, or commands used during hauling are lost to time. The reasons certain stones were chosen over others remain uncertain. We can replicate the mechanics, but the motivations remain human mysteries wrapped in the silence of millennia. What we do know overturns one of the most persistent myths in human history. That technological capability rises in a straight line. It does not. Knowledge appears, disappears, reappears, and transforms. The people of 10,000 years before now were not on a ladder moving upward. They were on a landscape moving outward, exploring possibilities. Their engineering was not a precursor to civilization. It was a parallel expression of human ingenuity. In the end, the stones moved not because people lacked technology, but because they possessed something more powerful, collective will. They chose to move them. They chose to build. They chose to shape their world long before they settled permanently in it. And so the quiet question that lingers is this. If engineering can thrive without cities, what does that say about what humans are truly capable of, even with only the simplest tools in hand? You are standing on a hillside in the early morning, sometime around 9,500 years before our present moment. The air is cooler than you expect, carrying the scent of wild grass and damp earth. Below you lies a shallow valley where, months earlier, your group gathered seeds from a patch of wild corn. Now, as sunlight hits the soil, something unusual becomes visible. The plants have returned, but not quite as they were. They grow denser, taller, more predictably, as if responding to the memory of your hands. It is subtle, a shift in pattern, not a revolution. Yet this tiny shift marks the beginning of one of the greatest transformations in human history. A dance between people and plants that neither species fully intended, but both would follow. What if I told you that agriculture did not begin as an invention, but as a relationship? For thousands of years before farming, humans gathered wild grains. They learned where plants grew best, when seeds ripened, and how to process them. But during the period when monumental construction reached its peak, something changed in this relationship. The same people capable of shaping stone into memory were also shaping landscapes, often without realizing it. Architecture demanded cooperation, feasting, and stability. The plants growing around them responded to these new rhythms. Archaeobotany gives us one of the clearest windows into this moment. At sites across the Fertile Crescent, charred seeds preserved in hearths and middens record the story, grain by grain. In layers datable to 9,500 to 8,000 years before the present, we find wild einkorn, wild emmer, barley, lentils and chickpeas. But the ratios begin to shift. Seeds become larger, their hulls become less brittle, their germination patterns change. These are the fingerprints of domestication. Not deliberate at first, but the result of humans selecting and reselecting plants that grew where people lived, walked, and discarded food waste. When we look at those seeds through ancient DNA analysis, another pattern emerges. Domesticated einkorn and emmer share genetic signatures that cluster around specific highland regions in southeastern Anatolia. These signatures show reduced genetic diversity, which is what happens when a species undergoes a genetic bottleneck due to human selection. Seeds from plants that did not shatter upon ripening were more likely to be collected, processed, and replanted near human camps. Over generations, plants that once depended on chance began depending on us. This is not a story of invention, it is a story of co-evolution. Why then does this moment occur precisely when monumental building is at its height? One answer lies in calories. Constructing large stone enclosures required periodic gatherings of workers from multiple groups. Feasting on an enormous scale supported cooperation. Animal bones at early monumental sites show mass processing events, but plants were just as crucial. Wild cereals ripen all at once. They can be harvested quickly. They store well when parched. They provide enough energy to support large communal tasks. When hunter-gatherers began returning to the same ceremonial sites year after year, they began interacting with plants in more predictable patterns. The land around these sites, trampled and enriched by human presence, became ideal germination grounds. Another answer lies in mobility. Before agriculture, human groups moved frequently, following herds, seasons, and rainfall. But with the rise of ritual gatherings and semi-sedentary habits, mobility shifted. People stayed longer in certain valleys, returned to them more often, and created micro-environments through fire, refuse disposal, and repeated harvesting. These practices increased plant abundance around human settlements. If a group harvested wild barley and scattered unprocessed heads near their camp, new growth emerged the following season at higher density. This inadvertent cultivation made it easier to stay for longer periods, which in turn increased the pressure to manage plant resources more intentionally. One of the quiet revolutions of this era is the emergence of sickle blades with gloss. The sheen on these blades comes from cutting large quantities of silica-rich grasses. Microscopic analysis of the gloss patterns tells us whether people harvested wild cereals or more structured stands of proto-domesticated plants. Around 9,000 years before the present, gloss becomes more uniform, suggesting that humans were harvesting fields where cereal stems were similar in height and density. This is what early cultivation looks like. People returning to the same patches, favouring certain plants, shaping the land without yet calling themselves farmers. Another pivotal shift comes from storage. Grain, unlike meat, can be kept for months. At early sedentary sites, storage pits lined with clay begin to appear more frequently. They are small at first, barely enough for a family supply. But their presence signals a new relationship with time. When you store food, you commit to the idea that the future exists in a form you can plan for. You can remain in one place, trusting that sustenance is waiting under the ground. This stability allows birth spacing to shorten. When food is stored, mothers can wean children earlier, leading to slightly higher population growth. More people mean more hands, more ideas, and more pressure to manage resources that now sustain larger groups. Plants become partners in this demographic shift. We also see changes in settlement layout. Dwellings cluster more tightly. Hearths appear in consistent positions. Workspaces become more defined. These patterns reflect increasing permanence, which in turn reflects the advantages of staying where plants grow abundantly. People begin to alter landscapes with simple tools, digging sticks for loosening soil, hoes shaped from bone or antler for turning earth, and baskets for carrying seeds. These tools leave subtle clues in archaeological layers, but their effects on plant communities are profound. The story of lentils and other legumes adds another layer. These plants fix nitrogen in the soil, improving fertility. When people began harvesting lentils and discarding pods near camps, they unknowingly enriched the soil for cereals. This created complementary planting zones. Cereals thrived in one area, legumes in another. Over generations, this synergy encouraged humans to think spatially about plant resources. The earliest gardens were not intentional farms, but emergent effects of human movement and plant ecology intersecting. As domestication accelerated, plants themselves transformed. Wild einkorn and emmer have brittle rachises that break apart to disperse seeds. Domesticated varieties have tough rachises that keep seeds attached until harvest. This shift appears clearly in archaeobotanical samples from the early Holocene. When humans gathered ripe spikes from plants that held their seeds longer, they selected for traits that benefited human harvest, but harmed the plant's natural dispersal strategy. The result was a relationship of mutual dependency. Humans relied on the plants, and the plants relied on humans to spread them. This dependency had far-reaching consequences. Stored grain enabled feasts. Feasts strengthened alliances. Alliances supported large construction projects. These projects brought groups together across vast regions. Their gatherings required even more food, encouraging greater investment in cultivation. A feedback loop formed between social complexity and plant domestication, each amplifying the other. The question of why agriculture arose when it did also touches on climate. After the Bulling Allerud warming, the Younger Dryas cold snap briefly returned harsh conditions. Then, as the world warmed again around 11,700 years before our time, stability returned. This period of climatic stability made plant growth patterns more predictable. When valleys green at the same time each year, humans can organize their lives around harvest seasons. This reliability fosters experimentation. If you know a plant will sprout in the same place next year, you can invest in protecting it, clearing competing shrubs, or loosening the soil. These small interventions accumulate into what we now recognize as agriculture. DNA studies of ancient grains also reveal evidence of multiple domestication events. Not all farming began in the same valley or with the same people. Domestication occurred in parallel in different regions, sometimes interacting, sometimes evolving independently. This decentralization suggests that agriculture was not a single invention, but a widespread response to similar environmental and social pressures. Plants and people were engaged in a shared exploration of possibility. Another overlooked dimension is cultural. Some archaeologists suggest that early cultivation may have had ritual or symbolic significance. Certain plants, especially cereals, appear in burial contexts from this period. Seeds placed with the dead may have represented life, cycles, or renewal. If certain plants were valued symbolically, this cultural importance could have encouraged their intentional propagation. The line between practical and symbolic is often thin in early societies. What feeds you may also define you. As cultivation spread, human mobility changed. Groups that once moved across vast territories began restricting their movements to zones favourable for plant growth. Territoriality increased. Land became more than a backdrop. It became a resource with boundaries and expectations. This shift laid the cognitive foundation for future concepts of property, inheritance, and long-term settlement. Plants did not just feed humans, they oriented them. Even so, humility remains essential. We do not know the precise motivations of early cultivators. We do not know whether they saw themselves as altering plants or simply responding to abundance. We do not know how they negotiated the labour involved, or how they resolved conflicts over land. What we do know is that the archaeological record shows clear patterns. Grain size increases, plant morphology changes, storage appears, ground stone tools proliferate, and settlement clustering intensifies. These clues, taken together, reveal a dance between species that began quietly and reshaped the world. As we step back from this early agricultural landscape, one realization stands out. Humans did not domesticate plants alone. Plants domesticated us as well. They anchored us to specific places. They demanded seasons of labour. They shaped our schedules, our social lives, our bodies and our histories. The birth of agriculture was not the triumph of human innovation, but the emergence of a relationship that neither side fully controlled. And so, we end with a question that echoes through time. When humans first coaxed plants to grow beside their homes, did they understand that this partnership would root us more deeply in the world than any monument ever could? You wake up inside a world that has never known a village. There is no word for neighbourhood, no concept of streets, no shared memory of houses standing side by side. And yet, when you climb out of your dwelling, the roof beneath your feet connects to the next roof, and the next, a continuous landscape of plaster and mud bricks stretching into the soft morning light. Below these rooftops are rooms, hundreds of them, each packed tightly against the others like cells in a living organism. Smoke rises from roof openings. People climb down ladders into their homes, disappearing into a maze of domestic spaces. This is around 8,500 years before our era, and you are standing in what may be one of the world's first villages. Nothing like this has existed before, and yet here it is, Uruk. What if I told you that the first villages did not emerge because humans wanted cities, but because agriculture changed the shape of time itself? When plants began to anchor people to landscapes, human rhythm shifted. Life was no longer governed solely by migration, seasons and herds. It became tied to harvest cycles, storage seasons, and the needs of crops that required tending. Time became place, and place became home. Archaeology shows this shift in the ground layers. At Uruk, houses were built tightly together with almost no exterior walls accessible from the ground. People entered their homes through openings in the roofs. Ladders led down into rectangular rooms coated with white plaster, smoothed carefully by hand. These floors were renewed repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times, each layer marking a year or a moment of renewal. Plaster is labour-intensive. Limestone is burned, crushed, mixed and applied in thin, even coats. The decision to maintain these floors so meticulously suggests a new idea taking shape. A home was no longer a temporary shelter, it was an identity. Inside these homes, walls were decorated with paintings of leopards, geometric patterns, and scenes that may have represented hunts or rituals. Bull's horns and clay figurines appeared in certain rooms, hinting at domestic shrines. Some houses contained burials beneath their floors, ancestors placed in shallow pits, then covered, then walked upon for generations. When a house was eventually abandoned or collapsed, its contents were carefully removed and the space rebuilt. This layering of floors, walls and burials creates a stratigraphy, not just of architecture, but of memory. People lived literally on top of their past. Another early village, Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan, reveals a different dimension of this new world. Around 8,000 years before our time, its houses were arranged in clusters rather than a continuous block. Each dwelling had plaster floors, hearths, and storage installations. But what sets Ain Ghazal apart are the statues, life-sized figures made of plaster, reed, and bitumen. Their faces are stylized, their eyes wide and inlaid with bitumen. Some stand upright, others kneel. These figures were buried in groups, as if they belonged to rituals tied to community identity. Their creation required enormous labour, gathering reeds, mixing plaster, shaping forms. All of this suggests craft specialisation, emerging in societies that were still technologically simple by later standards. In both Çatalhöyük and Ain Ghazal, refuse patterns tell an intimate story. In earlier hunter-gatherer settings, trash was scattered across landscapes or abandoned when camps moved. But in these first villages, refuse was managed. Ash, broken tools and food waste were placed deliberately in middens outside dwellings. These middens became shared community archives of daily life. The practice of managing waste reflects something deeper than sanitation. It reflects an understanding of shared space. When many families live close together, boundaries must be negotiated. This negotiation becomes culture. Agriculture intensified these shifts. When people rely on farms, they rely on predictability. Wheat, barley, lentils and peas required months of care. Storage became central. In these early villages, both large and small storage bins appear inside houses. Grain was stored not for the group but for the household. This subtle change marks one of the earlier signs of social differentiation. Some houses stored more grain than others, some had larger rooms, some had more elaborate decorations. Social stratification emerges slowly, not through kings or warfare, but through accumulation. More grain, more tools, more plaster, more labour invested in the home. Craft specialisation also expanded. In Çatalhöyük, certain rooms contained concentrations of obsidian flakes and blades. The nearest major obsidian source lies in the volcanic mountains of central Anatolia. People travelled days or weeks to acquire it, or traded with those who did. The presence of large obsidian workshops in some homes, but not others, suggests that expertise was becoming concentrated. Some people became known for their skill in knapping stone, others for producing beads, baskets, plaster, or clay figurines. These specializations were not yet professions, but they were steps toward a world where people no longer shared all tasks equally. The emotional life of these early villages is harder to see, but glimpses appear in the details. In many houses at Çatalhöyük, platforms built along the walls served as sleeping spaces. These platforms were plastered, renewed, and sometimes decorated with paint. Sharing sleeping platforms means sharing heat, safety, and stories. The walls, too, bear marks of hands smoothing plaster. The touch of many people accumulates over time. Homes become not just shelters, but containers of memory, experience, and identity. Another fascinating aspect of these early villages is the relationship between the living and the dead. Burials beneath floors were sometimes reopened, skulls removed, plastered, and decorated. These plastered skulls were then displayed in homes or communal spaces. When a home was rebuilt, new floors were placed over older burials. This layering created a sense of permanence and lineage. The household became a lineage, and the lineage became a place. Identity rooted itself in soil. This embedding of ancestors into homes may have helped stabilize village life. When the dead are literally beneath your feet, movement becomes difficult emotionally, not just practically. Agriculture already slowed mobility. Ancestors anchored it further. The first villages were not just clusters of buildings, they were social fabrics woven from generations of presence. Refuse deposits, too, reflect emerging community structure. At Ain Ghazal, large communal pits contain mixed deposits of animal bones, ash, and broken figurines. These pits represent shared events, feasts, rituals, or annual gatherings. Unlike the smaller household middens, these communal deposits speak of collective identity, not domestic routine. They show that early villages balanced private and public life, household and community, ancestry and innovation. Why does this moment matter? Because it marks the beginning of human time as we understand it. Structured, layered, predictable, and connected to place. When you return to the same house year after year, when your children grow up in the same room where your parents died, time takes on a new texture. It becomes cumulative. It becomes historical. The architecture of these early villages reflects this cumulative time. Houses at Çatalhöyük were rebuilt directly atop earlier houses, creating artificial mounds called tells. A tell is not a natural hill. It is a monument of memory shaped by generations of rebuilding. Every layer is a chapter in the story of a community. When archaeologists cut into these mounds, they read time like a book. Another dimension of village life is labour organisation. Agriculture demands cooperation. Planting, tending, harvesting, processing and storing all require coordinated effort. But cooperation also reveals differences. Some households may have had more labour available. Some may have controlled access to better land or more water. Over time, these differences led to subtle inequalities. We do not yet see kings or elites in these early villages, but we see hints of social hierarchy emerging. Larger homes, richer decorations, more elaborate burials. Even so, humility is essential. We do not know exactly how these societies governed themselves. No writing survives. No monuments declare rulers. What we do see is complexity, a world where social roles, identities and responsibilities evolve through daily practice. As we imagine these first villages, we must remember that for the people who lived in them, everything was new. The idea of home as a permanent identity was new. The idea of community as a stable group was new. The idea of storing food, plastering floors, painting walls, and burying ancestors beneath sleeping platforms. These were profound shifts in human experience. And so a quiet question lingers through the dust of these ancient rooms. What did it feel like to be the first human born into a world where time had walls, floors, and doorways, and where a home was no longer something you left behind, but something you carried within you? Imagine this. You watch the last light of day slip across an early Neolithic village, around 7,000 years before our time. In the world that existed before this moment, food was something that vanished with the sun. It had to be gathered, hunted, shared, eaten, or lost. But tonight, something different lies beneath the floor of nearly every house, beneath layers of packed earth and plaster. Inside clay-lined pits and sealed bins, there is food that will still be here tomorrow, and the next day, and the next season, and suddenly, time itself feels heavier, more predictable, more negotiable. This is the invention of surplus, the quiet moment when food became something you could own, protect, or share strategically. And with it, a new kind of human complexity emerged. What if I told you that the story of social hierarchy does not begin with kings or cities, but with a hole in the ground filled with grain? Storage is one of the simplest technologies ever created and one of the most transformative. It does not look impressive. A pit, a bin, a clay-lined container tucked into the corner of a home. But what these vessels represent is nothing less than the restructuring of human relationships. When food stops disappearing at sunset, the dynamics of power, obligation, security, and identity shift. Archaeologists recognize this shift through the soil, in villages dating to around 7,000 years before our present moment. From the highlands of Anatolia to the valleys of the Levant, storage installations begin appearing in large numbers. At first, they are small, shallow scoops in the floor lined with clay or plaster. Their contents, preserved through charring or desiccation, tell us what people valued most: barley, wheat, lentils, chickpeas. These pits were sealed with removable lids or packed with clay, keeping rodents out and humidity low. Their size suggests household-level storage, enough to feed a family through winter or through a poor harvest. But as time passes, storage becomes more formal. At some sites, like the pre-pottery Neolithic bee villages of the Levant, granary-style rooms appear. These rooms, built above the ground with raised floors and ventilation channels, were designed to keep grain dry and cool. Their construction required planning and cooperation. Building a granary takes time, materials, and knowledge about airflow and insulation. These buildings introduce something new, food that belongs to a group rather than to a single household. The grain preserved inside these structures reveals another layer of information. Carbonized seeds recovered through flotation techniques show changes in crop varieties. Domesticated einkorn and emmer wheat become more common. Barley grows in larger, more uniform stands. Lentils appear in greater abundance. This reflects not just agricultural success, but a growing dependence on plant-based calories that can be stored long-term. When people rely on storage, they rely on predictability, harvest cycles, seasonal rhythms, careful planning. Storage also reshapes mobility. A hunter-gatherer camp can vanish in hours. A village with storage pits cannot. When your food exists in a specific place, you exist in that place. You protect it. You maintain it. You measure your life around it. And this immobility, this tethering to season and soil, creates a new kind of social environment, one where neighbours must negotiate boundaries, obligations and responsibilities. Surplus introduces an entirely new vocabulary of human behaviour. When there is more food than can be eaten in a day, choices emerge. Who controls the surplus? Who distributes it? Who decides what happens when harvest is good or when harvest fails? These questions did not exist in mobile societies, but in early farming villages they appear in the archaeological record as early hints of inequality. At some sites, storage pits are not evenly distributed. Certain households have multiple pits, others have few. Some homes contain large, carefully crafted clay bins, others have only small scoops. Stratigraphy reveals cycles of rebuilding, where some houses invest in new plaster floors and larger installations, while others show fewer improvements. These differences suggest that wealth, measured in grain, was becoming uneven. But wealth is not the only dimension. Surplus also creates responsibilities. Food stored in a pit must be protected from insects, moisture, rodents, and theft. It must be guarded during winter. It must be redistributed during scarcity. In some early villages, communal storage buildings appear alongside household bins. This dual system hints at an early political negotiation. Households keep their own reserves, but they also participate in communal stores for ritual, feasting, or emergency redistribution. Feasts become especially important in this new world. Archaeological layers show large quantities of ash, burned bone, and discarded vessels associated with seasonal gatherings. Feasts redistribute surplus in ways that strengthen alliances. A household with more stored grain can host a feast, thereby gaining social prestige. Generosity becomes a form of soft power. Those who give the most, or the most often, gain influence. In societies without formal leaders, this influence matters. Craft specialization also ties into surplus. When food supply becomes more predictable, not everyone needs to focus entirely on subsistence. Some people can invest time in crafts, stone knapping, basket weaving, plaster production, bead making. Their expertise in turn generates value. If a household with surplus grain trades food for tools or ornaments, they are participating in a new kind of economy. Not yet trade as we think of it, but exchange shaped by the rhythm of stored resources. Another subtle transformation comes from risk management. Surplus allows families to buffer against bad years, but buffering can also create dependency. If a household stores more grain than it can eat, others may rely on them during scarcity. This dynamic creates forms of obligation and debt that archaeologists cannot see directly, but that behaviours imply. A household that shares its grain may expect support later in return. Labour, alliance, or other social capital. Storage even influences architecture. Houses become more specialised, with separate rooms for sleeping, cooking and storing. The presence of heavy storage bins adds weight to structures, requiring thicker walls, stronger foundations and more durable floors. This investment increases the cost of mobility. You cannot simply move away from a house that contains an entire year's food supply. Staying becomes the norm. Surplus also transforms ideas about the future. When food is abundant enough to store, people must imagine time months ahead. They think about harvest schedules, planting seasons, storage capacity and spoilage risks. This cognitive shift, planning far beyond the immediate present, is a profound change. It encourages long-term decision-making, investment in infrastructure, and intergenerational memory. The archaeological record also shows an increase in symbolic behaviour tied to storage. Seals, tokens, and marked stones appear in some Neolithic contexts. These objects may have helped track quantities or ownership, though their exact use is debated. What matters is the emergence of symbolic regulation of resources, an early hint of administrative thinking long before writing. Yet, for all these changes, we must remain humble. We do not know exactly how surplus was negotiated, distributed, or contested. We do not know whether conflicts arose or how they were resolved. What we see is the scaffolding forming beneath later social systems. The seeds of hierarchy, cooperation, and competition are all present, but not yet formalized. Storage also influences how communities define themselves. When food is stored in a house, that house becomes a center of identity. When food is stored communally, the community becomes a collective body with shared interests. These dynamics shape everything from rituals to daily labour. In some villages, storage facilities are located near shrines or communal spaces, suggesting that surplus had a spiritual dimension as well. Perhaps the abundance of grain represented blessing, continuity, or community strength. Another fascinating layer is gender. In many early farming societies, women likely played central roles in grain processing. Grinding, parching, storing, and managing daily food supply. Their labour, once tied to foraging and mobility, became tied to the stability and productivity of the household. This shift may have altered gender dynamics in ways that archaeology can only dimly infer. As we look across these early villages, one quiet realization emerges. Surplus changed not just the economy, but the psychology of human life. Food was no longer only a present tense phenomenon. It became a past tense, something gathered earlier, and a future tense, something kept for later. This temporal expansion allowed communities to grow, rituals to flourish, and identities to form around place, lineage, and home. The invention of surplus is the invention of possibility, but it is also the invention of vulnerability. When food is stored, it can be stolen. When food is abundant, it can be controlled. When food belongs to a household, households become units of negotiation and competition. When food belongs to a community, leadership emerges to manage it. This delicate balance between cooperation and inequality is the quiet root system beneath all later social complexity. And so, as we look back at these clay-lined pits and plaster bins from 7,000 years before our era, a soft question rises. Did people realise that by placing food into the ground for safekeeping, they were planting the first seeds of the societies we live in today? Imagine this. You bend down to pick up a small glossy black stone. It fits perfectly in your palm. Cool, glassy, sharp enough to cut through hide with almost no effort. You've never seen anything like it in your valley. No river here makes stones like this. No hillside carries this strange volcanic glass. And yet someone placed it in your hand during a gathering days ago, with a smile, with a gesture, with the unspoken promise of future friendship. To get this stone, someone walked days, maybe weeks. Someone crossed ridges, rivers and territories. Someone traded stories, meat, resin, beads. Someone made a choice. That connection is worth distance. And in that decision, they quietly expanded the world. What if I told you that long before roads, caravans or merchants, humans created highways of the mind, networks of exchange that stretched across whole landscapes? Between 7,000 and 5,500 years before our present time, the first great web of prehistoric trade emerged. Not trade as markets or currencies or contracts, but as relationships. A slow weave of reciprocity, trust, and shared risk binding that made life more stable and more connected. Civilization begins here, not in cities but in footsteps. Archaeologists can trace this network through obsidian, a volcanic glass that fractures with remarkable precision. Using geochemical fingerprinting, scientists can identify exactly which volcanic source produced each piece of obsidian. Every mountain has its own chemical signature, a kind of geological DNA. What the data shows is astonishing. Obsidian from central Anatolia turns up over 800 kilometers away. Pieces from eastern Anatolia appear deep in the Levant. Mediterranean shells appear in landlocked highlands. Red pigments from the Jordan Valley appear in plains far to the north. These objects are not accidents. They are threads connecting communities long before anyone carved a wheel. The question then becomes, why travel so far to exchange a single object? The answer, as so often in human history, lies in necessity balanced with meaning. Early agricultural villages faced unpredictable harvests, diseases of crops, shifting rainfall patterns, and the ever-present risk of conflict or scarcity. When people live in settled communities, their vulnerability increases. A dry year in a foraging society means you move elsewhere. A dry year in a farming village can be catastrophic. Trade becomes a buffer against disaster. By exchanging goods with distant partners, communities spread risk across regions. When your barley fails but your obsidian stockpile is full, you can trade for food, tools, or protection. These exchanges are not merely economic. They strengthen alliances, bind families, and create obligations that stretch across generations. The objects that moved tell us how these networks functioned. Obsidian blades travelled as finished tools or as raw cores ready to be shaped. Shell beads moved across hundreds of kilometres, their polished surfaces suggesting they were worn, displayed, and treasured. Flint nodules from specific quarries appear far outside their natural range. Certain pigments, especially red ochre, circulated widely, likely tied to rituals, burials, or symbolic practices. These materials were not chosen only for function. They held meaning, beauty, durability, scarcity, identity. Isotope analysis of human remains adds another dimension. By measuring the ratios of strontium and oxygen isotopes in teeth, researchers can determine where individuals grew up, because local geology leaves chemical fingerprints in the water people drink. In several Neolithic cemeteries, individuals were buried far from the place where they spent childhood. Some lived in multiple regions over their lifetimes. This is movement on a human scale. Spouses moving between communities, artisans travelling for work, groups merging and diverging. Trade is not just objects shifting, it is people shifting with them. Another clue comes from the way settlements cluster. In regions with dense obsidian networks, villages tend to form in loose chains along natural travel corridors, river valleys, passes, foothills. These are not roads, but paths beaten by repeated footsteps. Each village acts as a node, a place where information, goods, and relationships converge. When archaeologists map these paths, a picture emerges of a connected prehistoric world, not isolated pockets. Ideas move along these routes as well. Styles of pottery, architecture, burial practices, and rituals spread in waves. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from the exchange of exotic stones used for making beads. At sites across the Near East, beads made from marine shells, turquoise, greenstone, and limestone appear in contexts far from their origin. These beads often come from children's burials, suggesting that they held emotional or symbolic weight. They may have been gifts from distant communities, tokens of alliance or memory. Trade, in this sense, was a language, a way of saying we are connected without words. The mechanics of trade also reveal something profound about human cognition. To trade effectively, you must imagine someone far away. You must consider what they value, what they lack, what they can give. This requires a theory of mind, a mental space that includes not only your own community but a wider world. In a sense, trade expands the cognitive map of humanity. It forces people to think beyond their horizon, and once the mind expands, it rarely shrinks. Travel itself was part of this story. Journeys of tens or hundreds of kilometres were not undertaken alone. Groups travelled seasonally, carrying goods, stories, and obligations. Moving through territories required negotiation, hospitality, and courtesy. Archaeologists see signs of these interactions in shared tool styles, temporary campsites, and exchanged goods found along routes. Mobility was not random wandering, but structured movement along social pathways. One fascinating insight comes from examining breakage patterns on traded tools. Some obsidian blades were broken intentionally, snapped into fragments before being exchanged. Why break a tool that took hours to make? Because a fragment carries the signature of its origin. Sharing fragments may have been a way of spreading identity or cementing alliances. These fragments show that value was not purely utilitarian, it was relational. As villages grew larger, trade intensified. More people meant more needs: stone, salt, pigments, livestock, and grains. Some regions specialised in certain goods. Highland communities chipped obsidian cores with extraordinary skill. Riverine groups collected shells and fish. Plains communities harvested barley in abundance. This specialisation made trade increasingly essential. No village had everything, but every village had something worth sharing. This is also the period when long-distance symbolic styles begin to spread. Carved figurines with similar shapes appear across vast regions. Certain motifs in pottery, zigzags, chevrons, painted stripes, repeat far from their place of origin. These patterns are the fingerprints of social networks. They show that ideas travelled as surely as objects. What makes these networks remarkable is their stability. Over many centuries, exchange systems grew, contracted and shifted, but they did not vanish. This persistence suggests something important. Trade was not an occasional convenience. It was a structural part of early human society. It created reliability when farming was unpredictable. It created alliances when communities needed support. It created meaning when symbols moved with goods. And it created identity when people carried objects that link them to distant places. The rise of trade also changes how we think about early inequality. A household with access to rare goods, obsidian, shells, pigments, might gain prestige. Skilled artisans who could craft beads or blades from these materials gained status. Communities located near important resource sites gained strategic value. Power begins to emerge not only from stored food, as in earlier villages, but from stored relationships. Social capital becomes as important as material capital. Those who travelled, negotiated and maintained long-distance ties could shape their communities in subtle ways. But trade was not just about value, it was about obligation. When a village receives obsidian, it owes something in return, a feast, labour or future support. These invisible debts knit communities together. They create webs of reciprocity that hold groups stable even in difficult times. If your crops fail, your trade partners may help. If conflict arises, allies intervene. Trade is a form of insurance written into the landscape. Even so, humility remains necessary. We cannot fully reconstruct every journey, every bargain, every act of generosity or rivalry. We see only hints, stone paths, beads in graves, isotopes in bones, networks drawn from chemical signatures. But taken together, these clues reveal a world far richer, more interconnected and more dynamic than once imagined. And so the quiet realization settles in. The earliest foundations of civilization were not walls or temples or words carved in clay. They were the footsteps of people who believed that connection mattered. They walked inland to find obsidian. They walked to the coast to gather shells. They walked to forge alliances, not empires. In doing so, they stretched the human world until it became wider than any one valley. Perhaps the true beginning of civilization is the simple act of carrying something precious to someone far away, not because you have to, but because you want to. A cluster of houses rising out of the earth like a single breathing organism, each wall pressed so tightly against the next that you can hardly tell where one family ends and another begins. There is no king here, no writing, no rules carved into stone. And yet people are gathering in numbers the ancient world had never seen before, drawn by some mixture of opportunity, necessity and curiosity that archaeology can only just begin to trace. Around 5,800 years before the Common Era, settlements across the Fertile Crescent began to thicken in a way that felt different, heavier, almost gravitational. Something was pulling humans inward, and for the first time in our story, the shape of a city began to flicker into existence. The reveal lies not in a monument or a dynasty, but in a pattern. At places like Tel Es-Serwan in modern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered multi-room houses arranged in clusters, each room assigned a function with surprising consistency. One held storage vessels thick with the imprint of grains. Another contained grinding stones worn flat by years of use. Another still displayed evidence of weaving, its floor littered with spindle whorls. These were not the scattered households of early farmers experimenting with village life. These were specialized spaces nested together in dense neighborhoods that needed maintenance, boundaries, and cooperation. The walls themselves tell us this was more than a village. They lean into one another as if designed to spread load and buttress the weight of shared life. Information emerges where architecture meets landscape. The region around the Tigris and its tributaries offered a mix of opportunity and challenge. Seasonal floods deposited rich silt, but required careful timing for planting. Managing that tension sparked some of the earliest experiments with controlled water. At Tell Es-Serwan, archaeologists identified canal cuts and irrigation channels that were neither monumental nor political in scale, but practical in design. Early farmers learned to coax water into their fields through shallow ditches, distributing moisture to barley, wheat, and flax as the river receded. This was not the irrigation of later civilizations. It was the problem-solving of people trying to secure a harvest large enough to support growing populations. And population is its own kind of evidence. Estimates suggest that these settlements numbered in the hundreds, sometimes pushing toward 1,000 individuals living within a few hectares. Crowding creates pressure, it encourages cooperation, but it also forces solutions to new problems: sanitation, food distribution, childcare, conflict resolution. In this way, the first proto-cities were ecological experiments rather than political ones. They emerged because humans clustered in places where risk could be shared and resources could be managed together. The story grows clearer when we look at burial practices. In some early proto-urban settlements, individuals were interred beneath house floors, a tradition inherited from earlier Neolithic cultures. But in this period, burials become more selective, sometimes concentrated in specific rooms or communal buildings. This suggests that as populations increased, social identities began to change. Not everyone was buried within the same walls. Some households held greater symbolic importance, or perhaps certain rooms were dedicated to memory itself. The living arrangement thus mirrored the spiritual one. House clusters were no longer simply places of shelter. They became nodes in a web of ancestry, occupation, and status. Through this subtle layering, we see the earliest hints of social differentiation, long before hierarchy became formalized. One quiet detail reveals the heart of proto-city life: the floors. At Tell Es-Serwan and similar sites, floors were made of carefully laid plaster and renewed repeatedly over the centuries. This renewal required labour, organisation, and a sense of communal rhythm. People had to clear rooms, coordinate repairs, and share the knowledge of how to mix plaster that resisted wear. This is not the architecture of transient camps. It is the architecture of people committed to staying, of societies investing in longevity, of communities learning how to live side by side over multiple generations. And beneath these floors, archaeologists sometimes find caches of tools or ornaments that seem intentionally placed. They might be ritual offerings, or they might simply be the leftovers of a household's evolving identity. Either way, the layering of floors creates a kind of geological record of human time. Another clue comes from the distribution of materials. Excavations show that some households had more access to high-quality flint or imported goods than others. This does not yet indicate wealth in the later sense of the word, but it does reveal networks of exchange operating at the village scale. Certain families or clusters were more involved in long-distance trade, or controlled storage areas that link them to larger regional systems. We might be tempted to map this onto early inequality, but it is better understood as specialization born from proximity and need. As settlements grew denser, certain roles naturally clustered. Some individuals became the keepers of seeds or the maintainers of irrigation channels. Others became skilled in tool-making or textile production. Proto-cities thus emerged from interdependence, each household contributing one piece to a broader shared survival strategy. Landscape archaeology helps us understand why these places became magnets for population growth. Proto-cities arose in ecotones where rivers, fertile plains, and trade pathways intersected. Such locations offered not only food, but opportunity for interaction. If a settlement became known for its pottery quality or its reliable grain surplus, nearby groups might choose to settle there. knowing the benefits of joining an established network. In this way, proto-cities grew not because people were forced together by leaders, but because cooperation itself became a resource worth migrating toward. People gathered before they organised. There is also the matter of time. The tempo of daily life shifted. Earlier farmers moved in seasonal cycles, timing planting, hunting and gathering according to the landscape. But in proto-cities, time acquired structure. Plaster floors required annual maintenance. Irrigation channels demanded pre-planting coordination. Storage areas had to be inventoried. This is the beginning of scheduled life, of tasks that recur not because nature insists, but because society does. Once time becomes structured, it becomes shared. And a shared sense of time is one of the earliest foundations of urban life. Archaeologists studying Telesowan discovered evidence of defensive ditching as well. Whether these constructions were meant to deter animals, control floodwater, or manage external threats remains debated. But their existence tells us that communal labour was organised at a scale beyond individual households. Collective building projects mark a threshold in social complexity. People were willing to work together to shape not only their homes but the entire landscape around them. This suggests that leadership existed, though not necessarily in the form of chiefs or rulers. Leadership may have been temporary or task-based, emerging during construction or harvest periods and dissolving afterward. What matters is that coordination was possible without institutions. Social cohesion preceded formal governance. There is an intimacy to these early proto-cities that often surprises us. The close arrangement of rooms, the shared courtyards, the interconnected roofs formed a world where privacy was scarce and interdependence unavoidable. Noise would echo through narrow lanes. Hearth smoke would drift from one household to another. Children likely played in communal areas, watched by many eyes. Conflicts would flare and fade quickly, because neighbours had no choice but to confront one another again by nightfall. The archaeology of space tells a story of both tension and cooperation, of humans learning to negotiate life in high-density environments long before they developed systems of governance to manage it. Resolution emerges quietly. Proto-cities represent a moment when humans gathered more densely than ever before, not because civilization demanded it, but because life made it possible. Surplus from farming, early trade networks, reliable water, and shared labour all converged to make large communities sustainable, and as people gathered, they created new forms of memory, identity, and time. Civilization did not begin with kings or writing or bronze. It began when humans discovered that living together in great numbers could be its own kind of strength. Two houses built only a few steps apart on the same patch of earth, drawing water from the same river, harvesting grain from the same fields, and yet already beginning to drift into different worlds. One is broad and carefully plastered, its walls straight, its rooms wide, its storage jars heavy with last season's harvest. The other leans slightly where the mud bricks settled unevenly, its floors patched and thin, its storage bins nearly empty. In a single glance you can see the quiet birth of something that would shape the next 10,000 years of human existence. Around 5,000 years before the Common Era, inequality did not appear with kings or temples or armies. It began here, in places where humans had finally stayed still, long enough for difference to accumulate like sediment. The reveal comes from the ground. Archaeologists examining early farming communities from Anatolia to northern Mesopotamia began to notice patterns in the houses themselves. Some were noticeably larger, with thicker walls and multiple rooms dedicated to specialized activities. Others were modest single-room structures marked by heavy wear. The soil beneath them kept the memory of their use. grinding stones worn down to shallow plates, hearths rebuilt again and again, floors patched with thin layers of plaster indicating short-term repairs rather than large-scale renewal. These variations tell us something new was happening. Sedentary life allowed families to invest in their homes, and those with slightly more food, slightly more labour, or slightly more inheritance could create more stable spaces. Over generations, this difference widened. What begins as a practical response to need becomes a structural feature of community life. The information deepens when we look at burials. Earlier Neolithic groups often place their dead beneath household floors, suggesting a relatively egalitarian sense of ancestry. But in the 5th millennium before the Common Era, burial practices begin to diverge. Some individuals were interred with necklaces made from imported shells, finely crafted stone beads, or early copper ornaments. Others were buried with simple tools or nothing at all. At certain sites, clusters of richly equipped graves appear near the largest houses, while more modest burials occur at the periphery. Biological anthropology adds another layer. Skeletal remains from better provisioned households often show fewer signs of nutritional stress, fewer healed fractures, and longer lifespans. The human body itself becomes archaeological evidence for inequality. Permanent homes change the rhythm of life. When mobility is limited, possessions accumulate. Storage becomes a measure of security. Fields close to the settlement provide better yields, giving some households consistent access to high-value land. Those born into the right lineage inherit not only the house, but the position of that house within the landscape. Over time, the first faint lines of hierarchy appear not through force, but through proximity. Living near the central hearths or near communal buildings confers status. Being located near entryways or defensive ditches brings risk. Spatial analysis of early settlements shows that house size, location, and access to resources begin to align in predictable ways. Inequality is not yet institutional, but it is becoming structural. There is a subtle social dimension here. As communities grew, certain families took on central roles in craft production, ritual leadership, or trade mediation. Their houses serve not only as dwellings, but as nodes of activity. Archaeologists identify these through concentrations of specialized tools, residues of pigment or metalworking, or distinctive architectural features such as elevated storage platforms. These households likely held influence because their skills linked them to broader networks. Their status did not make them rulers, but it made them essential, and when a family becomes essential, the community begins to treat it differently. One of the most revealing forms of evidence comes from child burials. In egalitarian societies, status is not usually inherited. Children are buried simply because status must be earned in life. But in some late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic communities, children appear with grave goods as rich as those of adults: beads, tools, ornaments, even early copper items. This suggests that by this period, status had begun to pass through lineage rather than individual achievement. Inequality had become a story told to the next generation before they had lived a single day. Sedentary life also altered diet. Households with more access to storage or better fields consumed more cereal, more dairy, and sometimes more meat. Isotope analysis reveals nutritional differences between individuals buried within the same settlement. Some show higher levels of animal protein, others heavier reliance on grains. These distinctions map onto burial wealth and house size. Inequality was not only economic and spatial, it was biological, inscribed into bones and teeth. A quiet but significant detail lies in the construction of walls. At some sites, houses were rebuilt repeatedly in the same footprint. The continuity of architecture suggests a continuity of ownership, passing buildings and the land beneath them from one generation to the next. At other sites, houses were abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere, revealing lower status or less stable lineage. The archaeology of walls becomes the archaeology of inheritance. Inequality also appears in trash. Middens around wealthier homes contain more animal bones, more imported materials and more specialised tools. Sewer around poorer homes contain burned cereal husks, broken pottery and fewer traces of valued objects. Waste becomes a mirror for daily life. Even what a household throws away can reveal its place in the social web. What makes this moment so striking is that inequality did not emerge through conquest or coercion. It emerged through stability. Humans stayed in one place long enough for difference to accumulate. A slightly larger harvest, a slightly better field, a slightly more skilled ancestor. These small advantages compound through time. Sedentism magnifies difference because it prevents the reset button that mobility once provided. In mobile hunter-gatherer groups, belongings are limited by what can be carried. Food is shared to reduce risk. Social friction is resolved by movement. But in villages fixed to the earth, wealth can settle and multiply. And yet, even as inequality grows, the archaeological record shows that communities still maintain cultural cohesion. Communal buildings continue to operate. Festivals continue to bring households together. Networks of exchange still linked settlements across valleys. Inequality did not immediately fracture society. Instead, it became one more layer within an increasingly complex human world. People accepted difference because the benefits of staying together outweighed the cost of divergence. Resolution arrives quietly. Inequality appears not as a sudden break, but as a slow settling of differences, like silt carried by a river that deposits unevenly across the floodplain. By the time we reach the 4th millennium before the Common Era, the foundation is laid. Some households have more land, more storage, more symbolic goods, and more ancestor memory. Others have less. Civilization's future hierarchies are shadows on the edge of these early walls, and we are left with a simple, unsettling question. Once humans learned to stay still, was inequality always inevitable? Imagine this. A small riverside settlement that once held a few hundred people begins to stretch outward in every direction. Its edges no longer clear, its boundaries no longer meaningful. Houses multiply like cells in a growing organism. Footpaths harden into lanes. Lanes thicken into corridors. And for the first time in the deep human story, you could stand in the middle of a place where you could not see the horizon. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, in the southern plains of Mesopotamia, something unprecedented was forming. A community was becoming a city, not gradually, not hesitantly, but with a momentum so sudden that archaeologists sometimes call it the first great human acceleration. The reveal begins at Uruk, a site that would eventually become one of the most influential places on Earth. But in this early period, before writing, before empires, before kings carved their names into stone, it was simply a settlement responding to a shift in scale. Irrigation along the Euphrates created patches of predictable abundance. Canals pulled river water onto the floodplain, transforming what had once been seasonal marshes into fields of barley stretching farther than a day's walk. This reliable surplus did something remarkable. It allowed population to grow beyond the ecological constraints that had shaped human life for tens of thousands of years. Families that once might have split apart to form new villages stayed together. New arrivals joined instead of dispersing. Slowly at first, then suddenly, the settlement size increased by an order of magnitude. Information surfaces when we examine infrastructure. The earliest canals near Uruk were small, dug by hand with coordination that must have required some form of communal agreement. But as the settlement expanded, so did the waterworks. Canal mouths were reinforced, channels were widened, secondary canals branched like veins through the fields. Managing this system demanded collective labour on a scale previously unseen. Archaeologists studying canal alignments note that some were straight for kilometres, a task requiring planning, surveying and oversight. And yet this was not state-level engineering. It was community-level problem-solving, scaled upward by necessity. The city did not emerge from authority. Authority emerged from the needs of the city. Craft specialization accelerated next. Excavations in Uruk's early layers reveal entire districts dedicated to specific skills. One area was filled with evidence of pottery kilns, the ground stained by the heat of repeated firings. Another held workshops where stone was ground into bowls or polished into tools. Elsewhere, signs of textile production appear. Spindle whorls, loom weights, faint impressions of woven fibres preserved in clay. These were not isolated artisans. They were clusters of craft workers, each contributing to a larger economic network in which goods circulated through the settlement, like the water in its canals. For the first time, people could rely on the expertise of others, rather than producing everything within the household. Specialization is one of the signatures of urban life, and here it flourished long before formal administration. Architecture changed as well. The construction of the Anna precinct is one of the clearest markers of Uruk's transformation. This was not a single building, but a complex of monumental structures made from thousands of mud bricks shaped, dried, and assembled through coordinated labour. Their walls were decorated with cone mosaics, clay cones dipped in colour and pressed into facades to create geometric patterns that shimmered in sunlight. These surfaces were not merely decorative, they spoke to identity, shared purpose, and the ability of a community to undertake projects far larger than any individual or family. The scale of the buildings reveals something powerful. Once a population reaches a certain density, collective imagination expands. People begin to think in quarters and precincts, not in houses and clusters. Population estimates for Uruk during this period are astonishing. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, the settlement may have surpassed tens of thousands of inhabitants. No other place on Earth had ever reached such scale. The density alone reshaped daily life. Streets emerged from foot traffic patterns. Market areas formed in open spaces where goods could be exchanged. Waste management became a collective necessity. Archaeological deposits show layers of refuse carefully dumped outside major habitation zones, evidence that people were organising their environment with increasing intentionality. Complexity was not imposed. It grew from the ground up, layer by layer. Yet this urban expansion carried social consequences. With specialisation came interdependence. With interdependence came coordination. And with coordination came the first hints of administrative order. Clay seals and tokens appear in this period, used to mark storage containers or to account for goods moving through workshops. These were not yet writing, but they served as a physical language of management. A clay seal stamped with a distinct pattern indicated responsibility, oversight, perhaps even early notions of property. The city was learning to think in systems. Another piece of evidence lies in the distribution of food. Large storage facilities appear near the Anna precinct, with thick walls and spacious interiors designed to hold grain at scale. Their construction implies organised harvesting, shared storage, and collective distribution. People were no longer storing food only in their homes. They were placing it in communal facilities where it could be managed, allocated, and perhaps redistributed. Such centralization is one of the turning points in human social evolution. It marks the moment when survival becomes tied not only to land and labour, but to the structure of the community itself. Urban life required new rhythms, work became scheduled, irrigation depended on seasonal cycles, craft production demanded regular inputs, communal labour needed coordination. The flow of goods through the settlement required some form of regulation. Even without rulers, the city itself acted as an organising force, shaping the behaviour of its inhabitants. You could no longer simply live according to the sun or the seasons. In Uruk, life ran on the pulse of a growing metropolis. One of the most profound changes during this period was the emergence of monumental public space. The Yana precinct and other early temples served as centres of communal identity, places where people gathered for ritual, trade, or coordination. Their significance was not merely religious. They were physical anchors around which the city cohered. In a landscape without mountains or natural high points, these structures became the landmarks by which people navigated both physically and socially. The city was beginning to define itself through architecture. We often imagine early cities as chaotic, but the archaeological record shows a surprising degree of order. Districts formed around shared tasks. Roads converged on central spaces. Activity areas were carefully separated. Workshops here, homes there, storage beyond. This organisation suggests that even without explicit political systems, urban dwellers developed an intuitive sense of zoning. They need to manage thousands of people in a confined space, encourage predictable patterns of building, moving and working, and yet the human dimension remained constant. Beneath the monumental structures, everyday life continued. Children playing in courtyards, artisans shaping clay, farmers bringing produce from the fields, neighbours gathering around hearths. Cities did not erase humanity. They amplified it, concentrating voices, skills and ambitions into a single shared space. This concentration is what we call the first Great Acceleration. Once it began, it did not stop. Uruk would grow to influence regions far beyond its walls, shaping exchange networks, settlement patterns, and the very idea of what a city could be. Resolution comes with the recognition that cities did not appear because humans were ready for them. They appeared because humans had created conditions that made them possible. Surplus, specialization, shared infrastructure, collective identity. Uruk was not the result of a grand plan. It was the accumulated outcome of thousands of decisions made by ordinary people. And when those decisions converged, a new form of life emerged, dense, complex, and transformational. The story of cities begins not with rulers or writing, but with the simple fact that people gathered, worked together, and allowed scale to reshape their world. A line pressed into wet clay by a reed held in a human hand, a gesture so small it could have vanished in a moment, yet somehow it didn't. It dried, it hardened, and for the first time in all the long wandering of our species, a thought stayed exactly where someone put it. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, in the river cities of southern Mesopotamia, memory stopped being something carried only in bodies and began to live in objects. The world did not change in an instant, but a boundary was crossed quietly, almost invisibly, when marks on clay began to speak on behalf of people who were no longer present to explain them. The reveal begins long before the first true sign of writing. Archaeologists found small clay tokens scattered across ancient settlements, each shaped into simple forms, spheres, cones, tetrahedrons. Many carried incised lines or dots. For decades they were a mystery until researchers recognized their logic. These tokens represented quantities of goods, jars of oil, baskets of grain, animals. People used them to track obligations and to make sure exchanges happened fairly. As cities like Uruk expanded and thousands of transactions passed through workshops, fields and storehouses, memory alone became unreliable. Tokens travelled with goods. A shepherd might deliver wool and hand over a token to confirm the amount. A potter might surrender a token in exchange for barley rations. These objects were the tools of an early information system, designed to stabilise movement through a swelling urban world. The information deepened when those tokens were enclosed in small clay envelopes called bulli. Administrators, though they were not yet called that, placed tokens inside a hollow clay sphere and sealed it. On the outside, they pressed markings that matched the tokens within. This was a way to verify the contents without breaking the seal, a way for multiple hands to trust the same transaction. The bulla system represents a profound shift. Information moved from objects to symbols. Once the impressions on the outside reliably represented what was inside, the seal itself became the message, and soon the tokens placed inside became unnecessary. The marks alone were enough. From this quiet logic of representation, writing emerged. Instead of pressing tokens into bulli, people began pressing symbols directly onto flat clay tablets. The earliest tablets show rows of impressions, each representing a counted item: barley, fish, sheep, oil, workers, rations. These tablets were never meant to tell stories or preserve myths. They were tools of management, designed to track obligations across a community so large no single mind could hold its complexity. Cuneiform was born not from poetry, but from the need to keep a city functioning. Around this time, the reed stylus replaced the token. Its triangular tip left wedge-shaped marks that could be repeated with precision. Clay was plentiful, styluses simple to produce, and tablets easy to store. The shift from incised pictographs to stylized wedge impressions allowed scribes to write quickly, accurately, and in a compact visual language. Archaeologists studying early tablets note patterns that resemble spreadsheets more than literature, columns of entries, tallies, checks, and summaries. These early scribes were not authors, they were problem solvers, tasked with bringing order to the logistics of a bustling city. Writing stabilized bureaucracy. Without it, accounting for grain collected from distant fields or redistributing goods to specialized workers would have been impossible. Archaeologists found tablets listing barley rations distributed to brewers, weavers, and laborers. Others summarized contributions to large building projects, revealing early attempts at coordinated economic planning. There were tablets that recorded the number of workers present on a particular day, the type of work done, or the quantity of raw materials needed by a workshop. Each entry was a small anchor point in the expanding network of urban life. Writing did more than record transactions, it preserved ritual. In early cities, religious institutions handled major public works, storage and redistribution. Priests and administrators worked closely, using tablets to track offerings, maintain calendars, and distribute food during festivals. The written record allowed rituals to remain stable even as populations grew. A feast could be prepared at scale because someone knew exactly how much grain had been collected weeks earlier. Offerings could be coordinated across districts because the quantities were recorded rather than guessed. Writing gave ritual a precision that oral tradition alone could not guarantee. Identity changed as well. Seals carved from stone became signatures, pressed onto tablets to authorize or verify entries. Each seal carried unique patterns, animals, geometric forms, mythic figures, serving as both identification and protection against misuse. These seals reveal an emerging sense of personal agency within the administrative world. A sealed tablet was a promise, a responsibility, and sometimes a claim. Through writing, society found ways to trust individuals within a system too vast for intimate reputation to control. Writing also reshaped time. Before tablets, memory flowed with the rhythms of the body, vanishing as generations passed. With writing, events could be fixed, obligations extended across seasons, and histories maintained across decades. A scribe could read a tablet written by someone long dead and act on its instructions. For the first time, the present was accountable to the past. Writing tethered time itself to material reality. Yet writing remained humble in its earliest form. The tablets of the late 4th millennium before the Common Era do not sing praises or tell epics. They speak of sheep, grain, labour, and water, the quiet machinery of urban life. But from these simple marks came the possibility of more complex forms of thought. Once a symbol could represent a quantity, it could represent an idea. Once a tablet could record a transaction, it could record a law. Once a law could be recorded, it could be debated, preserved, or changed. Writing allowed one mind to speak to another across distance and time. It allowed a city to think collectively, to store information outside the fragile human brain, and to correct itself through generations. Civilization did not begin with the tablet. It began with the recognition that a mark on clay could preserve trust. Everything else followed from that. The resolution arrives with a quiet clarity. Writing is often credited as the moment history begins because it grants permanence to decisions, memory to societies, and structure to communities too large to rely on spoken agreement. But the deeper truth is simpler. Writing did not invent civilization. It allowed civilization to remember itself. Every mark pressed into clay by those early scribes was an attempt to hold steady a world growing faster than memory could sustain. And through those marks the human story became more than a sequence of forgotten days. It became a record. And in that sense the story ends not with Sumer, but with the quiet realization that civilization is less an invention than a long remembering, a slow gathering of humans, stones, plants, and time.